So fundamental rights, they are laid down in the part 3 of the Constitution from Article 12 to 35. They are inspired by the Bill of Rights in US Constitution. The fundamental rights are the very foundation of cornerstone of the democratic way of life which the Constitution insists. Apart from the guaranteeing certain basic civil rights and freedoms to all, they also fulfill the important function of giving safeguard to minorities and outlawing discrimination. And protecting religious freedom and cultural rights. During the emergency, however, some of the fundamental rights get curtailed. But these curtailments of fundamental rights are of temporary nature. Why fundamental rights? Because of its important part 3 of Constitution containing fundamental rights is often referred as Magna Carta of Indian Constitution. Magna Carta of Indian Constitution. Magna Carta was a charter of rights issued by the King of England in 1215 and is considered the first written document of fundamental rights. Fundamental rights are called the fundamental because of two reasons. Why fundamental? Because of two reasons. One is they are guaranteed by the Constitution. And the second reason is they are fundamental to all around development of individual. Fundamental rights must not be read in isolation, but it should be read along with directive principles and fundamental duties. So it should be read along with directive principles and fundamental duties. Features of fundamental rights are: number one, it is justiciable in nature. That means the court would restore them in the case of their violation. Fundamental rights promote the ideal of political democracy as opposed to the social and economic democracy which is promoted by directive principle of state policy. So political democracy is promoted by fundamental rights. Limitation of the executive as well as the legislature. Limitation of legislature and executive. The fundamental rights act as a limitation on tyranny of the executive and arbitrary laws of the legislature. Fourth point is reasonably restricted fundamental rights are not absolute but qualified. Reasonable restriction. on fundamental rights. State can impose reasonable restriction on them. Thus, the balance has been sought between the individual liberty and social control. So, there must be a balance between these two things. The fifth point is negative as well as positive. Fundamental rights are negative in the way the character as they place limitation on the state. Negative in the way limitation on state. The fundamental rights can also be positive in the way as they confer certain privileges upon person. So fundamental rights, the sixth point is they are amendable. Although they are fundamental rights, they can be amended or even repealed through the Constitutional Amendment Act. The only caveat is that any such amendment should not upset the basic structure of the Constitution. So seventh point is against state as well as private person. So fundamental rights can be implemented against state as well as private person. All fundamental rights are available against the arbitrary action of state, but some fundamental rights are available against private individuals also. Fundamental rights have dual aspect. Fundamental rights have dual aspect. From one point of view, they confer justiciable rights on people which can be enforced through courts against the government. Another point of view is fundamental rights constitute restrictions and limitation on the government action. The government cannot take any action, administrative or legislative, by which a fundamental right is infringed. Fundamental rights can be amended, repealed, infringed only by Constitutional Amendment Act. But even the Constitutional Amendment Act should not disturb the basic structure of Indian Constitution. Coming to eighth point, fundamental rights can be suspended during emergency period except for Article 20 and 21. Other fundamental rights can be suspended during operation of national emergency under Article 352. National emergency except for Article 20 and 21. Other fundamental rights can be suspended during national emergency. Ninth point is Article 31A to 31C. Any law falling under the ambit of Article 31A, 31B and 31C. In Article 31A, it is described about the law of agrarian reforms can encroach upon Article 14 and 19. Agrarian reform. Article 31B, it is law added in 9th schedule. It must not go against the basic structure and it should be read along with Article 21 and Article 14, Article 19. 31C, law of implementation of DP directive principles under Article 39B to 39C cannot be invalidated just because they are violative of Article 14 and Article 19. Some fundamental rights are available only to citizens of India. 10th point is only for citizens. And some fundamental rights are available to all persons, whether citizens or foreigners or legal persons like corporation or companies. Fundamental rights available only to citizen are Article 15, right against discrimination. On the grounds only of religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. The second, Article 16, equality of opportunity in public employment. Article 19, freedom of speech and expression. Assembly, association, movement, residence and profession. Article 29, protection of language, script and culture of minorities. Article 30, right of minorities to establish and administer educational institution. Restricted from armed forces. 11th point, restrictions on fundamental rights for armed forces. The Parliament can restrict or even abrogate the application of fundamental rights to the member of armed forces, paramilitary forces, police forces, intelligence agencies, and analogous services under the Article 33. Implementation of restriction during martial rule. Restrictions during martial rule. Fundamental rights can be restricted in any area where martial rule, military rule is imposed due to abnormal circumstances. It is under the Article 34. These were broad features of fundamental rights enshrined in the Part 3 of our Constitution. Categories of fundamental rights. There are nearly 6 categories of fundamental rights. There are 6 categories. 6 categories. First one is 14 to 18, rights to equality. Right, then 19 to 22, right to freedom. Third, 23 to 24, 23 and 24, right against exploitation. Fourth is 25 to 28, freedom of religion. Twenty-nine, 30, cultural and educational rights. Sixth is Article 32. It deals with the right to constitutional remedies.